Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. It is my pleasure to have our February meeting of the MIT Club of Boston Women's Leadership Fireside Chat. It's a bit of a mouthful here. Our guest speaker today is Radhika Dutt, and I would, rather than me going over and talking about all aspects of her career and life, I'm going to let her introduce herself through her stories. So I'm going to ask her a number of questions, and we'll start with the introduction. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your career so far.
First of all, thank you so much for having me, and I'm so excited. I actually know some people here, and one person, Kyle, who I knew all the way from 1999, so thrilled to be here. So in terms of my career and kind of what got me here, I came to MIT as an international student, did electrical engineering and computer science, and started my first company right out of our dorm rooms at MIT, which was called Lobby 7, which you guys would appreciate. And so that was my first foray into entrepreneurship. It was wonderful to have all these lessons to learn at a much faster pace than I would have learned, I think, had I been in a larger company. So made lots of mistakes as an entrepreneur, and ran into what I called product diseases, which is where, you make these mistakes and you build products, but, things don't necessarily go well. And it's because you don't have a clear vision and strategy. But over time, I learned how to do better. So after doing some startups, I went to Avid Technology, which, by the way, was a company founded by an MIT alum as well. And at Avid, we grew, so Avid used to be in the post-production space, meaning, practically every movie ever made that had won an Oscar had been edited on Avid. And so it was this glamorous industry where, you worked on things where you saw stuff that the tools that you were making were then out there actually making movies. So it was this glamorous industry to be in. And so I worked in broadcast where, our tools were what helped news get on air. So I worked there for 5 years, and we really grew the broadcast division, and we were incredibly vision driven. So at the time, Sony was the dominant player in broadcast, and we came in as this newbie in broadcast, and my role was to figure out what customers needed and then build that product. And so in the span of 5 years, we really just dominated that market, and ousted Sony as the major player. And so but then when the management at Avid changed, I left Avid and followed the CFO to Starent, which was in telecom. And Starent was later acquired by Cisco. Then I was bored. I started another company, Likely, which this time was in the wine space, and we built Netflix for wine. The company was acquired. And then I went to advertising. And so in advertising, I built a product that was for TV advertising, working at Allant, and that company was acquired by Axiom for the product that I built. And so I guess the theme you see here is that, every job that I've ever held has always been in a new space, something I'd never entered. And so what got me to where I am today is that last step, when after Allant, after I sold that product, I went to a robotics company where, we were building robotics for warehouse management. And in every single company over the last 20 years, I kept seeing the same set of product diseases. Remember the one I was telling you about that I ran into at Lobby 7? The same sort of product diseases happen at every company, and you run into newer diseases, and sometimes you've learned enough and you see others go through these same diseases. And that's what led me to Radical Product Thinking, which is a book that I wrote. And Radical Product Thinking is a methodology for how do you build products that are successful in a repeatable way. Like, how can we be vision driven and build products? And so the book is out. It just came out in September, actually. And so my work now is that I work with companies in building world-changing products. Like, how can we do that systematically? And I'm against the Silicon Valley approach of, oh, let's just iterate and try things, we'll like see what sticks. I don't do that. My belief is instead that we can start with a clear vision and very systematically translate that into reality. And yes, iteration is useful, but iteration is not what builds world-changing products. It's necessary, but not sufficient, to use nerdy terms that we all love.
That's a great intro to your whole career. So now, since we're talking about leadership today, maybe you could tell me what your definition of great leadership is, and would that definition be different for men and women, in your opinion?
So, there's one visual that I've created to talk about leadership that I find really useful. So hopefully you can see my screen. I put this visual together because, I feel like it's intuitive, and yet once you see it put in this way, it is kind of really, it makes you reflect, right? So if we think about leadership, to me, leadership happens on two dimensions. So one is the dimension of being able to provide enough direction to teams, how well we communicate a very clear vision and strategy. And we're either effective at that or not as effective. And the other dimension is how frequently do we interact with our teams in giving them course corrections, let's say, and interacting with them to be able to give them feedback, etc. And so when we do effective communication, but we just don't have the time to see our team very often, what ends up happening is the seagull style management, right? We've all been there where you work on a project for a long time and then you show it to your boss, who then looks at it and goes like, oh, this is not what I asked for. And so it's the swooping, pooping and leaving kind of style of management that drives us nuts. The opposite of that is where you don't provide effective communication. There isn't clarity of a vision or a strategy. Maybe you have it all in your head. And then what you end up resorting to is a lot of frequent communication so that you can get what you want out of it. And this is micromanagement. But what's interesting to me is over the last few decades, this approach to management has really been glorified, right? And Elon Musk even talks about how he is a nano manager. Like this is seen as being a good thing now, whereas in reality, like we can do so much better. And that quadrant is really where we can be effective at communication, have really this clarity of vision and strategy, and we provide frequent enough direction that or have frequent enough interactions that we course correct along the way. And that is what I call vision driven leadership. And so in this case, right, teams have autonomy and they feel like they're contributing to a shared vision. And there's research that shows that when teams feel like they have autonomy, people are not burnt out, that they're able to be more involved, engaged, etc. And so, Diane, you were asking what's the difference in leadership style between men and women, or how is leadership different for men or women? I think women have a much higher bar that they have to pass in terms of leadership. If you aren't leading in just the right way, you face a lot more criticism. So the seagull style of management and micromanagement, if you try that as a woman, the feedback is going to be super harsh. Even for men, like this is going to be harsh feedback, but it's much more tolerated. If a woman did what Steve Jobs did, like often his style was actually, he would wait for a while, see what teams came up with, and sometimes trash what they did, right? Like that is in effect sometimes seagull style. If a woman tried that, like that just would not go over well. Similarly, someone trying micromanagement as a woman would be very hard. So I think it's especially important as women if we can learn to be vision driven in our management style. And so how can we do that? The approach that I take when being vision driven, and this is what radical product thinking is about, I feel like very often the idea of what is a good vision is just really inadequate, right? Like we've learned that a good vision is big and audacious, and a good vision is seen as something like, to be the leader in blah, blah, which is really a completely BS and fluffy sort of a vision that tells you nothing about how do you achieve that. And so a good vision to me is one that answers the who, what, why, when, and how. Whose world are you trying to change? What does their world look like? Meaning, what exactly is the problem? Why does it need changing? And that to me is like the key question. If we cannot say why the status quo is unacceptable, like we should not, like we have nothing to communicate as a vision. And then what does the world look like when we're done? And finally, how will you bring that about? So that's a detailed vision. If you can share with your team that sort of a vision, that's effective communication to me. And that's the kind of alignment we need across our teams. And similarly, I talk about a strategy in the book and what I mean by strategy, but I think that's the kind of effective communication which we can then translate into, giving people an intuition for how do you make decisions, etc. It's that sort of combination of communication and frequent interactions that we need, that would be considered good leadership in my books.
Okay, great. Now, I'd like to move a little bit to talk more specifically about your leadership journey and any obstacles that you might have faced and how you overcame them.
So on this one, right, I'm going to be very frank in terms of what obstacles I've faced. And I think probably say things that not everyone can always say. And I feel grateful to be at a point in my career where I can say these things. And I think more of us need to talk openly about such issues. I think for me, one of the biggest obstacles was actually getting to having a title where it was a leadership position. I think as a woman and a woman of color, it's hard to get to a point where you have authority along with leadership. I always had to, exert my leadership skills, because of my soft skills, never with the authority that came with a certain title, etc. And so a lot of people of color or women, people who come from marginalized societies might find that, in your career, you end up having to exercise that soft power just for a very long time. And so, yes, what are such obstacles? I think if I think back, to what that meant in my career, very often that meant that I was playing well above my title. And the kind of role that I took on, if I described what I did, and the title that I held, it was typically like, it just didn't align very well, right? And so the obstacles are, one, I think we have to be able to recognize that this happens. So if we want to, okay, well, there are two aspects to this. One is how can we change things? And I'll talk about that in a moment. And two is recognizing what happens. So in terms of the recognizing, things that you might want to look out for. If you're interviewing people, instead of asking them about their title, it would be really helpful to ask people, well, what exactly did you do? And see kind of at what level they were playing, and what their activities were like. How can we change things? Very often people talk about, well, we can mentor others and help people develop these leadership skills through that mentoring, etc. To me, mentoring is only really useful if you also provide opportunities to go with it. So when you think about mentoring people, it's not just about helping develop those skills, help them find roles that are those leadership roles. So those would be the two things that I would say, are really key in terms of obstacles that I faced in my own career and kind of what we can do differently moving forward.
So in a way, I think what you're talking about is sponsorship. instead of really just mentorship. Mentoring isn't enough. You need more than mentoring. And I have to say that I agree with you that the titles that we have do not match all the things that we do if we are women. And we do way more, it seems like. And we stay stuck in a position for a much longer time. And that has to do really with how we're perceived. And if a man did what we did, they would be promoted. But because we're a woman, we're not getting promoted.
And there is such an interesting effect that happens in ourselves as a result of this. And I'll give you my example, and I'll share an article that I wrote up. So growing up, I always believed that we lived in a meritocracy, right? Growing up, my parents had exactly the same expectations that they had for me as they did for my brother. There were never gender constraints about what they thought I could achieve, right? And I grew up with this idea that it's a meritocracy. When I was at MIT, there were some classes where there weren't very many women, but I never even thought about that, right? I always thought, you work hard enough and you get exactly what you want. What changed for me was at a certain point in my career, like even actually when I worked through a lot of these early, even when I worked in my early career in companies and I wasn't given those promotions, I always thought that, if only I worked a little harder, or if there was something that I need to learn, maybe I'm just not building enough consensus, or like I would always try to think about what is it that I could do differently, right? And it was a point in my career when I was starting that company, the wine company I was talking about earlier called Likely. That was the first time in life that I realized actually it's not about what I can it's not about my abilities and how much harder I work. There are some systemic biases that are very hard to get over. So it hit me in entrepreneurship because let's look at the stats in entrepreneurship. Only 2% of venture funding goes to women. And if you look at women of color, it's like less than 0.3% or somewhere around there. 0.3% goes to women of color, right? So it's a ridiculously low statistic. So when I was raising funds for my startup Likely, I had so many good meetings and so many VCs would tell me, wow, this is the best pitch I've ever heard. Let's keep talking. And, I got this feedback where people 10 years later still remember my pitch from back then, right? And yet, we just weren't closing that funding. But I kept thinking, if I just worked hard enough, I'm going to do this, right? And so I remember there was this one VC I spoke with, and I showed him, what our conversion funnel looked like, which was, looking pretty good, really. And he says to me, okay, but if you can get me these numbers, then I am willing to invest. I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this, right? So 6 months later, I come back to him and I show him the numbers that he wanted to see. And at that point, the VC says, actually, investment is just a gut-based decision, and I'm just not feeling it. And that's the point where you realize, oh my God, it didn't matter what I did. That's kind of the systemic block that you just can't get over, right? And I saw so many other just peers of mine who didn't face these obstacles, who were white and male, and they were able to get funding, and people who were right out of college, but who were able to get funding for their startup, right? And in the same space that I was in. And so this was what led me to realize that, wow, it's not about kind of your own achievements or your own abilities at the time. And what really taught me this was I went to a talk by a woman, Peggy McIntosh, and what she talks about is, things that give us privilege. And every one of us has some things that give us privilege and some things that don't, right? So for example, we all have MIT degrees, and that gives us privilege because people assume you're good unless you prove otherwise. For me, when I applied to MIT, I had privilege in that I could afford the testing fees. I had parents who were supportive and who, encouraged me to apply, etc. there are many people who can't because they don't have those things. So there are things that, if you think of the social line of justice, and this is what Peggy McIntosh's work is about, there are some things that put you above the social line of justice and some things that put you below. And so each one of us has to think about what puts us above or below. Like, for instance, even if you're, let's say, a white and a male, okay, yes, that puts you above the line. If you have a speech defect, that puts you below the line. And so, what we're able to achieve is a sum of a lot of these things that put us above and below the line. And so what I really realized from this experience is that for us to create this world that's more equitable, we have to recognize what gives us privilege and what doesn't, because it's not enough to be colorblind or gender blind, etc. We have to understand what gives us privilege and what may not give someone privilege, so that we can actually think about how we can be more inclusive, whether we're hiring people or working with people.
Great, thank you. I guess now we'd like to talk about, what do you consider your greatest accomplishment and why? I'm willing to guess something, but I'm going to let you speak.
I think my biggest accomplishment that I'm proud of is the book that I've written. And I think it's really, I say that it's a window to my soul, right from the dedication all the way till the acknowledgements and the last word. I feel like it was exactly the book that I wanted to write. And, I get bored reading these books where it's one concept and you stretch it across 10 chapters where you're writing the same concept in 15 different ways. But this book is really, it's deep. It's about how we can be vision driven. And it talks about how we can build these world-changing products, sharing a global perspective of people who build these visionary products, and how we can apply these ideas, whether we're doing activism or building a digital product or anything, right? And I think one of the most important parts of that book to me is about digital pollution. So digital pollution is this term that I coined. What I really wanted to convey is the idea that, just as the industrial boom led to environmental pollution, over the last decade and a half, our just carefree growth in the tech industry has led to what I call digital pollution. And, it's 5 types of digital pollution that I talk about in the book. One is attention hijacking, that everything is vying for our attention. And as a result, what we're able to absorb is just not nuance, but sound bites. And that makes us, not be critical thinkers. It's created polarization in society, both wealth and ideological polarization. Eroding of privacy is another type of digital pollution, which, without privacy, it's really hard to have democracy. Another example is this erosion of our information ecosystem, where it's easy to gain information, but not to gain knowledge. Where it's really hard to tell what's fact and what's fiction. So I talk about these different types of digital pollution and how we can build products that avoid this digital pollution. And yeah, to me, having written this book, like, that feels like the achievement that I'm most proud of, because it's a thoughtful book that I would have wanted to read.
Great. I think that's the best model for writing a book, is something that wasn't there for you and you wish you had had it and it would have helped you. And so you're writing it so everybody else can get that advantage that you didn't have. I'm actually in the same boat as you. I'm writing a book like that too.
Oh, how exciting.
So my last formal question for you has to do with advice. What advice would you give younger women in STEM to help them along their leadership journey? So,
the one thing that Peggy McIntosh said to me that day when I met her, and I wish someone had told me this when I was much younger. she said, don't internalize it. And as women, or, as people of color, etc., what often happens is when we don't get those promotions, it's always important to learn what we can do better. Yes. But we often end up internalizing it, thinking that it's a fault of ours, that we just weren't good enough. And being able to tell what you can improve, but yet not internalizing this sort of systemic biases, I think that is super important. And that's that would be my one piece of advice for people. I don't mean this in the way that, we shouldn't ever get arrogant that there's nothing we can improve. That's by no means the message. But, I realized that I had internalized a lot of those biases into questioning myself and didn't have enough confidence when I was younger. And it was only after that entrepreneurship experience that I really felt like I was really good at what I do, and it's okay if I don't get the rewards that are deserved, or not that it's okay, but like more that at least it's not my fault. And that was a really important message that I think isn't shared by very many women. Like very often women just who get to where they do often say, well, just grow a thicker skin, try harder, etc. Sometimes it's important to hear this permission that you may not get what you want, just don't internalize it.
Well, that's definitely good advice for your health. I mean, I feel like many of my failures are things that help me do something bigger and greater. And in some ways, I thank the people who didn't promote me, because it forced me to do something completely different that I would never have done if I had been promoted. So, but I think the internalizing it is definitely bad for your health. So it holds you back. So letting it go, just being more of a Buddhist and saying, oh, letting it go and finding some other opportunity, that is really great. Okay.
There's actually one other piece of advice, like which I also wish someone had taught me. I think as women, we often don't take up space. So, when I talk about this vision-driven type of leadership, right? I think we very often, and this especially happened to me early in my career, I think we don't talk as much. And very often my male counterparts who are my co-founders at Lobby 7, for example, very often they would say things or speak up, etc. And I always thought at the time that, well, maybe they knew better than I did. And that's why they knew what to do, because, they were saying all these things about what we should be doing. And I questioned, maybe it's just that I didn't know enough. And that's the thing, right? I think we need to be willing to share ideas and talk things through. And one of the things that I've realized is finding your voice as a woman, to be able to take on such a role and get others to see you in that role, it really helps if you take a facilitative approach. So here's what I mean by a facilitative approach. When you have a group of people, you can be the person who leads that group through a visioning exercise, let's say. And in the radical product thinking way, and you can download the toolkit online, by the way, it's on radicalproduct.com, there is a vision statement that I use. And I always tell women that, use that vision statement as a fill in the blank statement, and do this as a group exercise where you're leading that group exercise, and you're telling people to fill in this vision statement. By taking this facilitative approach, you're getting everyone to speak up, but you're kind of controlling or helping the conversation and facilitating the conversation. We very often don't take on such a role, and I think this makes it easier to do that. Another sort of facilitative role that I use is when we're talking about an important decision. Well, let's think about how we prioritize the decision, right? Like when we were in school as well, we always thought about like a decision was, long-term versus short-term. So do I party tonight or study for my exam, which would be the long-term, right? So it was always this long-term versus short-term trade-off. So you can make those trade-offs explicit. And the way I do that is I draw up an X and a Y axis on the whiteboard. Your Y axis is your vision, that's the long term. Your X axis is the short term, which is it going to help you survive? And so the way you talk about a decision is you say, okay, is it helping us do both? In which case, well, that's of course ideal. That's an easy decision. You probably, that's easy to make, right? The harder decisions is when you have something that's good for the long term, it's good for the vision, but it's not helping you in the short term. So that's where you're investing in the vision. And the opposite of investing in the vision is where you're taking on vision debt. It's like technical debt, but on the vision side. So it's helping you in the short term, but it's not good for the vision, right? And so when you're making a decision and you communicate to your team this vision versus survival and how you make that decision, again, you put yourself in that facilitative role, you're in front of a whiteboard and taking a stand. And I think it really helps people see you in that role, in that leadership role. So that's the second piece of advice I wish someone had shared with me. Take up space.
That is a really good advice. I really like that. I'm going to share that with my students, from Radhika to my class. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording so we can open up the questions to the audience.